Chapters 13 and 14 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13. 1809. The Peace of Vienna. As soon as the armistice was arranged, Napoleon returned to Vienna and resumed his residence at Schönbrunn, where he remained until the peace was signed 3 months later. From the summer place of the Habsburgs, he governed his empire and conducted the negotiations with Austria. The middle of August, the plenipotentiaries assembled in the little city of Altenburg, on the border of Hungary, just within the lines of the French occupation. M. de Champagny, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, represented the Emperor, and the Austrian mission was composed of Comte de Metternich and General Baron de Nugent. Napoleon had invited the Czar to send an envoy armed with full powers to represent the interests of Russia at the conference, but he failed to do so. This action was unfortunate, as the time necessary to communicate with St. Petersburg retarded the work of the ministers, and kept important questions in suspense for many weeks. In arranging the terms of peace, Napoleon endeavored so far as possible to meet the views and quiet the fears of his ally. As a basis for the negotiations he held that the vanquished nation should suffer a considerable loss of territory, as well as a reduction in its military power and the payment of a large indemnity. From every point of view the territory to be detached seemed to be designated in advance. Galicia should be severed from the Austrian Empire, either in whole or in part. Napoleon considered himself in honor bound not to replace under the Habsburg yoke a people who had aided his cause and compromised themselves for him. But it was not so easy to decide what disposition he should make of this province. His first idea was to erect Galicia into a sovereign state, and give it to the Grand Duke of Würzburg. This prince was a brother of the Emperor Francis, but a friend and great admirer of Napoleon. Transferred to Cracow, he would give up his estates in Germany, which would then be at the disposition of the Emperor, to use in rewarding some of his adherents. From a remark made later by Alexander, this arrangement would not have displeased him, but Napoleon abandoned the plan because he thought that it would increase the fears of the Czar to have a second independent state erected on his frontiers. What Napoleon really desired was to strengthen the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a state created by him, and devoted to his interests, but he was very much in the dark as to how the Czar would view any further increase in the territory of Warsaw. In a conversation with Caulaincourt about the middle of July, Alexander vaguely indicated 2 plans. Leave Galicia to Austria, or make arrangements which will not affect the position of Russia, or cause apprehensions regarding her safety. Napoleon quickly arrived at the decision that whatever part of Galicia was severed from Austria should be allotted, 4/5 to himself and 1/5 to the Czar. To equalize in a certain degree this disproportion in the division of the spoils, he would bind himself formally in writing never to restore Poland entirely. Realizing the difficulty and the danger of this solution, Napoleon instructed Caulaincourt on the 12th August to ascertain how the Czar viewed the matter. Caulaincourt was urged to forward his reply at the earliest possible date. Meanwhile, the Emperor directed his representative at Altenburg to confine his discussions to general matters. He also insisted that a procès-verbal should be kept of the proceedings at the conference, and the reports sent promptly to St. Petersburg, in order to avoid false rumors about what was discussed. Established in the heart of Austria, occupying her finest provinces, eating and drinking at her expense, Napoleon could afford to take his time while awaiting the information from Russia upon which to base his final decision. It soon transpired that Austria also had adopted a policy of delay, with the same view of ascertaining the position of Alexander. Somewhat recovered from the shock of Wagram, Francis seemed inclined to resume hostilities rather than submit to a dishonorable peace. He based his hopes on an uprising in Prussia, the success of the Walcheren expedition of England, or a French reverse in Spain, but above all on favorable news from Russia. "We must sound Russia," he said to Metternich, "and put ourselves in shape to resume the fight." While awaiting a reply to his personal letter to Alexander, Francis ordered his envoys to mark time up to the end of August, and to take advantage of this delay to discover the intentions of Napoleon. Restrained by these instructions from both sides, the negotiations dragged along without accomplishing anything. Outside of the formal meetings, however, some progress was made in clearing up the situation. While Nugent, who was a soldier rather than a diplomat, showed much resentment, Metternich, on the other hand, displayed great goodwill. He sought every opportunity to see M. de Champagny, and to be agreeable to him. The French minister kept open house, and gave many dinners and receptions, at which the Austrian ladies were present. On the occasion of the fete given the 15th August in honor of Napoleon, Metternich proposed a toast to "the peace," to the great indignation of his colleague. Metternich, however, had outlined in his talks with Champagny the kind of peace he had in mind: the restoration of the conquered provinces, a lasting reconciliation cemented by an alliance; in a word, a peace on the model of that concluded 2 years before between France and Russia on the banks of the Niemen. To imitate Russia, with the secret thought of taking her place in the favors of Napoleon, such was to-day his object, his hope; and the dream which he cherished would have been to attach his name to an Austrian Tilsit. In his personal interviews with M. de Champagny, he returned constantly to the same subject. An alliance with Austria, he said, would have been the true means for Napoleon to reach his end, to pacify Europe and overthrow England. The Emperor failed to seize at Pressburg the finest occasion of his reign. However, the occasion lost in 1805 might be found again in 1809. Enlarging on his topic, he confirmed the opinion held by Napoleon from the first, that a firm stand on the part of Russia would have averted the war. And what had she done during the war? She had not fired a volley, and had only shed the blood of the Poles. He continued: "We can serve you as well as Russia, and perhaps more constantly, for our cabinet has not such a vacillating policy. Let us enter your system, and you will be sure of us. It is upon this base, honorable for us, useful for you, that we have counted on making peace." It would have been well for Napoleon if he had taken this course. The only statesmanlike alternatives were, to win Austria's friendship by generous treatment, or to crush her to the earth, so that she could not rise to strike another blow. Napoleon adopted neither alternative. His mind still possessed by the English vendetta, Russia with her extensive sea coast seemed of far more value to his continental system than Austria, whom he proposed to rob of her only remaining port. He therefore preferred the uncertain alliance of Alexander to the gratitude and friendship of Francis. For the second time he stood at the parting of the ways, and again he took the wrong path. With all his great qualities, Napoleon lacked the true instincts of a statesman. On the 1st of September, an aide de camp of Alexander arrived at Vienna. He was the same Colonel Tchernicheff who had been present at Wagram on the staff of Napoleon. He was not an accredited envoy, but he brought personal letters from the Czar to Napoleon and Francis. In his letter to the Emperor, after expressing his satisfaction over the prospects for peace, Alexander places his interests entirely in the hands of his ally, counting formally upon his friendship. "Your Majesty sees all the frankness and all the openness of confidence which I place in you. I have the right to expect that you will use the same toward me." From this letter only one conclusion could be drawn. Having allowed Napoleon to bear the brunt of the war, Alexander placed on his shoulders the burden of making peace. He confided his interests to Napoleon, and put himself entirely in his hands. This placed the Emperor in a most embarrassing predicament. The interests of Russia were summed up in the one word, Poland. How could the treaty be drawn so as not to revive the fears of the re-establishment of that unfortunate kingdom? To Champagny he wrote: "I have several plans, but I will never consent to expose to the vengeance of the House of Austria those who have welcomed us in that province (Galicia)." The letter from Alexander to Francis was brief, polite, and meaningless. He discreetly advised Austria to make peace, and excused his inability to contribute to the result on account of his distance. "It would have been a great consolation to me," he said, "to offer my good offices, and to bring about a reunion of interests and friendship between Austria, France, and Russia." His letter on the whole was calculated to favor the interests of Napoleon, and it certainly had this effect. There was evident at once a change in the tone of the Austrian plenipotentiaries. With shrewd diplomacy they made haste to offer Galicia, having seen in that province a point of dissension between France and Russia. They looked upon it as the least valuable of their possessions, and as the one most likely to raise difficulties between Napoleon and Alexander. The Emperor of Austria, however, before deciding finally to resume the war or to resign himself to peace, wished to ascertain at first hand the final word of the conqueror. He therefore wrote a personal letter to Napoleon, and sent it to Vienna by the hand of one of his aides de camp, General Comte de Bubna. On his arrival at Vienna, the 9th September, Bubna was struck by the universal desire for peace expressed on all sides, both by the Austrians and the French. All the members of the Emperor's staff were tired of their stay at Vienna, and anxious to be back in Paris. From this feeling Napoleon himself was not exempt, as appears in his letters to Joséphine at this time. He was in haste to finish with Austria, in order to give his time to other enterprises, particularly the war in Spain. Although the thought of the Austrian marriage had not yet entered his mind, Napoleon was tempted to try the experience of an alliance with the House of Habsburg. In the last campaign, Austria had shown energy and military force. At Essling, her troops had fought as stubbornly as the Russians at Eylau. The greatest obstacle would lie in the feeble, vacillating character of the Emperor, and for a moment Napoleon thought of replacing him by his brother Ferdinand or the Archduke Charles. He even suggested the idea to Bubna, who said that the Emperor would do whatever was called for by the best interests of his country. But Napoleon, who realized the delicacy of such a question, did not put it in the form of a demand. In order to hasten the conclusion of peace, Napoleon now made concessions from his first demands. Having asked for 9,000,000 souls, to have 5, he agreed to accept 4. He succeeded so completely in subjugating Bubna that the latter talked of returning to the Austrian headquarters, and arranging matters in 24 hours. Napoleon, however, was not yet ready to let him depart. He had Bubna write his court and formulate the proposition on the basis of population, avoiding for the present the designation of the territory to be ceded, as he was still waiting for more definite advices from Russia. It was not the fault of Caulaincourt that the attitude of Russia was still unknown. The ambassador had shown great zeal and energy in searching for information. Unfortunately, the Emperor was laid up as the result of an accident, and the Minister of State was out of town. Rumenzoff had gone to Finland to meet the Swedish envoys and sign a triumphant treaty of peace, which ceded that province to the Empire as well as the Åland Islands, and which was to win him the title of Chancellor. Caulaincourt called every day to inquire regarding the health of the Czar, who received him for an hour or two, and conversed in a friendly way, but avoided all political topics. When the ambassador finally succeeded in bringing up the question of the peace, he found it impossible to obtain any definite opinion from Alexander. He was even more vague than usual. At last, on the 28th August, Alexander expressed himself more clearly. "You know that I am not a difficult person. As an individual I admire the Emperor Napoleon. As a sovereign I revere him, and besides I am really attached to him. I only search for the best way to smooth out the difficulties, avoid differences, and forestall consequently any cause for war. Moreover, I wish to maintain the alliance. Therefore I desire to be in accord with you, but in a manner reasonable for my country, and which assures the future tranquillity of Europe." Caulaincourt then asked whether the Czar would advise the Emperor to deliver up those who had served him to the vengeance of his enemies, and Alexander replied, "I have already told you what I think about that matter. As I do not desire to raise between us an insurmountable barrier, I will add that I am not so unreasonable as to oppose the acquisition by the Grand Duchy of a district in Galicia, if that province is taken from Austria." Encouraged by this unexpected concession, the ambassador brought up the point of the unequal division between Warsaw and Russia, but the Czar again drew back. "Assure the Emperor Napoleon," he said, "that I have no other view than to be in accord with him, but I cannot sacrifice the interests of my empire." It was impossible to draw out of him anything more positive. Caulaincourt immediately sent a literal detailed report of this interview, which reached Napoleon on the 12th of September. Reading the dispatch in the light of his own desires, the Emperor assumed that he was now free to act. It was sufficient to him that Alexander no longer put a formal veto on the extension of the Grand Duchy. He paid no attention to the phrases qualifying that assent. With his usual impetuosity and disregard for the rights of others, he concluded that, so long as Russia had yielded on this point, she would acquiesce in all his designs. Under the empire of this fallacious reasoning, Napoleon made his final decision. The 15th September he sent away Bubna with a reply to the letter of Francis, and at the same time dispatched an ultimatum, setting forth the losses in population to which Austria must submit. He demanded 1,600,000 in Illyria, 400,000 on the Danube, and 2 millions in Galicia, to divide between the King of Saxony and Russia. He then wrote Champagny to press the negotiations as much as possible. Bubna returned to Vienna on the 20th of September, and was received by Napoleon the same evening. "What do you bring? Peace or war?" demanded the Emperor. Then, without even opening the letter of Francis, which he put in his pocket, he cried furiously that Austria did not want peace. Referring to the insistence with which Galicia was offered, he declared that they were endeavoring less to negotiate seriously than to throw an apple of discord between him and Russia. In this game, he continued, Austria would risk her existence. If the war were recommenced, he would pursue it à outrance. He would dethrone the dynasty, separate the states, and keep possession of the territory occupied by his troops. He then discussed and justified one by one the points of his ultimatum. When Bubna objected that Austria could not give up Trieste, and lose all contact with the sea, the Emperor replied, "In that case war is inevitable. Will you break the armistice, or shall I?" Napoleon then threw his hat across the room, his gesture of great anger, and retired to the embrasure of a window, where he seemed to be absorbed in a profound meditation. Suddenly, as if struck by a new idea, he turned, and exclaimed with great vivacity, "Do you know what remains for us to do? If your Emperor finds my terms too hard, let him refer them to Russia as arbiter. We will conclude an armistice for 6 months. The Czar will send an envoy to Altenburg, and I will abide by his decision." Never did Napoleon display to greater advantage his marvelous histrionic ability. This coup de théâtre, which he had prepared and executed with supreme art, had a tremendous effect. The Austrians would not fail to say, "If the Emperor Napoleon himself offers with so much assurance to place his cause in the hands of Alexander, he must feel very sure of Russia. That court has doubtless been consulted in advance, and approves of the terms submitted." In making this proposition, Napoleon was very certain of his ground, for Metternich had let drop the remark at Altenburg, "We cannot remain another 3 months in this position. We must have peace or war." After this interview with Bubna, which had lasted 3 hours, Napoleon read the letter from Francis, and drafted his reply. It was harsh and bitter in its terms, but became milder at the end, where he said, "I am so persuaded that the right is on my side, that I will consent to the meeting of a General Congress, to which shall be admitted even the plenipotentiaries of England; and I propose that you and I, Monsieur mon frère, shall submit our case to the arbitration of the Emperor Alexander. By this last proposition I certainly give the most striking proof of my repugnance to shed blood, and my desire to re-establish the peace of the continent." Upon reflection, Napoleon decided not to send this letter, as being too harsh in terms. But he communicated the substance of it to his envoys, as a basis for their final negotiations. In the face of the appalling perspective indicated by Napoleon, the courage of Francis oozed out. It was not worth while to risk his crown to save a few provinces. In order to hasten the conclusion of peace, the conferences at Altenburg were suspended, and all the envoys met in Vienna. The Austrian plenipotentiaries, Bubna and Liechtenstein, were authorized to accept the terms of the French ultimatum, subject, if possible, to some concessions in minor points. Under the personal supervision of the Emperor, the negotiations were pushed rapidly to a conclusion. In order to flatter the amour propre and the patriotism of the Austrian envoys, Napoleon made several minor concessions. He allowed Austria to retain 3/5 of Galicia, which he thought would please Alexander, even though Russia lost Lemberg, the only point of much value which figured in her allotment. He also reduced the indemnity to 75 millions. Exceeding their powers on the 14th of October, Liechtenstein and Bubna signed the treaty, subject to the ratification of their master. Without waiting for this, Napoleon announced the peace by salvos of artillery and started for Paris. There was such an explosion of popular joy that Francis did not dare to withhold his signature, and submitted to the inevitable. By the Treaty of Vienna, Austria lost 3.5 million subjects; 400,000 passed to Bavaria; 1,200,000 were added to French Illyria; 1,500,000 went to the King of Saxony as Duke of Warsaw, and the remaining 400,000 to Russia. In order to appease the Czar, who might well feel dissatisfied with his small share of the spoils, in an official letter to Rumentzoff, under date of the 20th October, Champagny writes: "The Emperor wishes not only to destroy the idea of the Renaissance of Poland, so far from his thoughts, but he is disposed also to concur with the Emperor Alexander in every measure which can wipe out the recollection, in the hearts of the ancient inhabitants. His Majesty approves that the words Poland and Poles shall disappear not only from all political transactions, but even from history." However just may have been Napoleon's treatment of Russia, he had nevertheless made a grave political blunder, full of fatal consequences for the future of the alliance. "It was more than they had won," said the Emperor, and this was true. Napoleon, as one of his historians observes, had in the highest degree the loyalty of the field of battle. This artful politician was a soldier beyond reproach. He had the religion of the service rendered, and no one ever saw him dispute the price of bloodshed in his cause. If Russia had come generously and unreservedly to his assistance, as the conditions of the alliance demanded, Alexander could have claimed any recompense within reason, and Napoleon would have fully accorded it. As it was, the Czar got all that he deserved, and more. The Polish question, born at Tilsit with the creation of the duchy, aggravated by the terms of the new peace, was now almost beyond the possibility of a satisfactory solution. The Peace of Vienna marked the supreme crisis of the Russian alliance. 14. 1809. Marriage negotiations. Upon his return from Vienna, instead of going to Paris, Napoleon went directly to Fontainebleau, where he had summoned Joséphine, his confidential ministers, and the princes of his family. He came back with his mind absolutely decided on the divorce. The hazards of the last campaign, during which his fortunes had more than once trembled in the balance, had finally convinced him of the necessity of assuring the permanency of his work, by giving a direct heir to his dynasty. For 2 years he had been in a state of indecision, but now his mind was settled. It was his intention during the stay at Fontainebleau to prepare Joséphine for the sacrifice, and to persuade her, if possible, to descend voluntarily from the throne. At the same time he wished to begin negotiations for a new matrimonial alliance, and to prepare the minds of his people. To govern better the imaginations of men, Napoleon considered it indispensable never to let them be troubled or led astray by the prolonged expectation of great events. He therefore wished to make the period of transition between the two empresses as short as possible. When Joséphine descended from the throne, there must be another princess ready to take her place by his side. At the moment his preference was for the Grand Duchess Anne, the sister of Alexander. The choice was natural and practically designated in advance. The question was not a new one between him and Alexander, as it had already been brought up at Erfurt. At that time the elder sister Catherine had been considered, as Anne was then too young. Since then Catherine had been married, and the choice at present was confined to Anne, who was now nearly 15, and presumably sufficiently mature for marriage. Before considering any other alliance, Napoleon thought himself in honor bound to resume and bring to a head the negotiations informally begun at Erfurt. Otherwise he might furnish the Czar with a legitimate subject of discontent, and strike another blow at the Entente. Having reached this decision, the important question remained: What was the best way to begin the negotiations? At Erfurt, Alexander had indicated an impediment without suggesting any means of removing it. If a family alliance, he had said, was his dearest hope, it was not himself but his mother who would make the decision. The Empress Dowager had retained all authority over her daughters, and would marry them as she wished. The will of the late Czar expressed in a solemn act had given his wife this right. Since the meeting at Erfurt, where he was present, Caulaincourt, upon his own initiative, without any formal instructions from the Emperor, had constantly endeavored to obtain new light on this subject. He had observed that on all formal occasions, while the Czar posed as chief of the state, his mother appeared as head of the family. The day of the betrothal of Catherine and the Duke of Oldenburg, it was the Empress Mère who presided over the ceremonies in the chapel of the Winter Palace, who gave the hand of her daughter, and received their homages. He had also remarked the extreme care of the Czar to efface himself, and to appear only as a witness, like a private individual. In a letter to the Emperor in February 1909, Caulaincourt had advised his master that "the first official approaches must be made to the mother." Napoleon considered himself too strong and too great to follow such a course. What had he to do with the will of a woman, to defer to her reasons of state? Besides, he could not imagine that the Czar of all the Russians was not a master of his own household. If Alexander set up the opposition of his mother, it was only a pretext, not a reason. Although the sojourn at Fontainebleau had not advanced the question of divorce, as Napoleon had not yet found courage to announce his decision to Joséphine, he decided a few days before their departure for Paris to take the matter up at once with the Czar. He had invited the King of Saxony to visit him at Paris, and the arrival of that monarch hastened his return to the capital. On the 14th of November, at the head of a large military escort, the Emperor left for Paris, where he arrived at nightfall. Joséphine was compelled to make the journey alone in her carriage. The following days he received at Tuileries his ministers and the diplomatic corps. With the return of the sovereigns the gay life of the capital was resumed. Every evening there were dinners, concerts, balls, special performances at the opera and the theatres. A little later there arrived the kings of Würtemberg, Holland, Naples, and Westphalia. Paris became again le séjour des rois. Never had the court been so gay as during these last days of the Empress Joséphine. A week before the announcement of the divorce, on the 22nd of November, the Emperor instructed Champagny to write Caulaincourt a letter, which, for the sake of greater secrecy, the minister was ordered to code himself. It was worded as follows: "Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, you know the entreaties made to the Emperor for a long time past by the men most attached to his person, and to the great interests of his dynasty. These approaches have been for a long time without result. However, everything leads me to believe that, after having profoundly reflected on the situation of France and of his family, the Emperor is finally about to decide upon a divorce." At Erfurt the rumors of a divorce came to the ears of the Emperor Alexander, who must, having spoken to the Emperor about them, and having said to him that the Princess Anne, his sister, was at his disposition. "The Emperor desires you to take up the matter frankly and simply with the Emperor Alexander, and speak to him in these terms: I have reason to think that the Emperor, pressed by all France, is preparing for a divorce. May I announce that we can count on your sister? Let your Majesty think the matter over for 2 days, and give me a frank reply, not as to the French ambassador, but as to a person devoted to the two families. It is not a formal demand which I make. It is a frank statement of your intentions which I solicit. You will not speak of this matter with Monsieur de Rumenzoff, under any pretext whatsoever. And when you have had this conversation, as well as that which should follow it 2 days later, you will forget entirely this communication. There remains for you to let us know the qualities of the young princess, and above all the epoch that she may be in a condition to become a mother, for in the actual calculations 6 months of difference are an object. It is not necessary for me to recommend to your Excellency the most inviolable secrecy. You appreciate what you owe in this respect to his Majesty." Of course the injunction for secrecy, too customary in such cases to deceive any one, had for its object the guarding of the dignity of the two emperors in case the plan failed. Besides, it was second nature with Napoleon in all cases to avoid committing himself definitely to any proposition, while striving to blind the other party. In this instance his tactics were also justified by the reasonable doubt as to the maturity of the princess. The sole reason and excuse for the divorce was the necessity of giving as soon as possible an heir to the empire. Before making a formal demand, therefore, he wished to be assured upon this delicate point, as well as whether the proposition would be accepted. The letter to Caulaincourt was coded, and ready to be dispatched, when Napoleon was informed that Russia demanded written assurances against the reestablishment of Poland, which Caulaincourt had not dared to give. The text of the Treaty of Vienna, received by the ambassador on the 27th of October, had been transmitted immediately to the Czar. Alexander was much dissatisfied with the provisions regarding Galicia; and the letter proposing to efface the name of Poland, which came 10 days later, was too late to repair the damage already done. Alexander expressed himself, however, as willing to accept the guarantees offered, provided they were put in a form strictly binding on France. He was no longer willing to accept the simple word of Napoleon. The courier was held back while Champagny wrote a political dispatch ordering Caulaincourt to sign such an agreement at once, "in a frank and open manner which removes every suspicion and every arrière pensée, by proving that we have none." The courier was again on the point of starting when M. de Rumigny, a relative of the Duc de Vincennes, entered the hotel of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He had come directly from St. Petersburg, and brought the advice that the Czar would be content with nothing less than a treaty. Napoleon, who was impatient to have nothing stand in the way of the accomplishment of his desires, directed Champagny to add a postscript to his second dispatch, giving Caulaincourt carte blanche to sign a convention. There was no time to go into details, and the ambassador was left entirely to his own discretion. In general terms he was told to refuse nothing which would dispel all ideas of the reestablishment of Poland. Giving way to the passion of the moment, the Emperor offers implicitly to the Czar to deliver up Poland to him as the price of a Grande Duchesse. On the last day of November, 2 weeks after their return from Fontainebleau, Napoleon finally found the courage to break the news to Joséphine. At the first mention of the word divorce, she fell on the floor apparently in a swoon. Calling to his aid the prefect of the palace, Baron de Beausset, who was on duty, they carried the Empress down the narrow, dark, winding staircase to her apartment on the ground floor. Here Napoleon placed her in the charge of her women, and withdrew with tears in his eyes. When Eugène, who had been called from Italy, arrived a few days later, he found his mother more calm and apparently resigned to her fate. It only remained to agree with the Emperor and the Empress upon the arrangements to be made, and the formalities to be carried out. Everything was settled with a dignity worthy of such a great event. The divorce arranged, Napoleon was in haste to conclude the new marriage which he hoped could take place by the end of January. To make his formal demand for the hand of the Grand Duchess Anne, he only waited now to be enlightened upon the 2 points in doubt: the favorable disposition of the Russian court, and the maturity of the young princess, for the necessity of an heir to France could not be delayed another year. While awaiting the reply from Russia, the Emperor neglects no means to prepare the minds of his people and propitiate his ally. At the opening of the Corps Legislatif, the first week in December, he says in his address: "My ally and friend, the Emperor of Russia, has united to his vast empire Finland, Moldavia, Wallachia, and a district of Galicia. I am jealous of no benefit which can accrue to this empire. My sentiments for its illustrious sovereign are in accord with my politics." His phrase regarding the principalities had the effect of a declaration against his former friend, Turkey, and was very helpful in re-establishing the badly compromised affairs of Russia in the East. The operations of the Czar's armies along the Danube had not been successful during the summer, and the latest news was decidedly unfavorable. Encouraged by the unexpected turn of events, the Turks had showed themselves less disposed than ever to cede the 2 provinces. At the request of Napoleon, the agreement between the 2 emperors at Erfurt had thus far remained a secret. To-day, in order to serve Russia, Napoleon tears aside the veil, announces the incorporation of Moldavia and Wallachia in the Russian Empire, and gives the Sultan to understand that this is done with his entire consent. In the words of the all-powerful Emperor, the Turks will recognize the decree of destiny, and will resign themselves to submission. Napoleon thus comes to the assistance of the hard-pressed armies of the Czar at a critical moment, and apparently decides the fate of the day. On the 9th December, the Emperor ordered Champagny to send a copy of his address to Caulaincourt, accompanied by the real news of the Russian defeat, and the statement that this was his reason for speaking of the reunion of the two provinces to Russia. "That the Emperor may thus see that I do not vacillate, and that I even do more than I promise." In communicating these facts to the Czar, the ambassador is to insinuate that the Emperor has made a gift of a province which more than pays all the expenses of the late war. It is for the Emperor Alexander to comprehend, and to appreciate, a conduct so different from his own, and which speaks for itself. Let Alexander seize this opportunity to square himself for once. Let him accede with good grace, without delay, to the formal demand for his sister, which can no longer be put off, and will follow immediately. On the 13th December, 2 days before the final pronouncement of the divorce, the Emperor called Champagny to the Tuileries, and dictated to him the following letter to Caulaincourt: "Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, I have made known to you the projects of the Emperor by my coded letter of November. Since then the Viceroy has arrived. The Empress, convinced of the grandeur of the circumstances and the urgent need of the State, has been the first to facilitate the divorce. Everything therefore leads me to think that Friday next a decree of the Senate, Senatus Consulte, will pronounce the dissolution of the marriage of the Emperor by mutual consent. The Empress preserves her rank, her title, and a suitable dower. Being as you are upon the spot, Monsieur, the Emperor relies entirely upon you regarding what should be done. You ought then to act upon these 3 positive underlying ideas. 1. That the Emperor prefers, if you have no objection which can change his opinion, the sister of the Emperor of Russia first of all. 2. That in this case the moment should be calculated, because all this being an affair of politics, the Emperor is in haste to secure his great interests by having children. 3. That not the slightest importance should be attached to conditions, even to those of religion. You have then at this moment all the latitude necessary to conduct yourself with the prudence which the circumstances demand, and to proceed if there is an opening, without more delay. It will then be very grievous if the response which you make to this letter leaves us in doubt; and although this affair may fall through, as the result of the information that you have acquired, regarding which the Emperor relies on you, or by the refusal of the assent of the Russian court, the essential point is that you shall proceed if there is an opportunity. In all your combinations start from the principle that children are what we want. Therefore, explain yourself, and act in accordance with the present letter, which has been dictated by the Emperor. His Majesty has entire confidence in you, knowing your tact and devotion to his person. The Emperor desires to know positively, before the end of January, what to expect." Having sent this letter, Napoleon decided, by a declaration made in the face of all Europe, to reassure Alexander on the subject of Poland. On the 13th of December, his Minister of the Interior, M. de Montalivet, read at the session of the Corps Legislatif his annual report on the condition of the Empire. After recapitulating the events which had occurred since the last session, he gave his official interpretation of the aggrandizement of the Grand Duchy. The Duchy of Warsaw is enlarged by a portion of Galicia. It would have been easy for the Emperor to reunite to this state the whole of Galicia, but he did not wish to do anything which could give inquietude to his ally the Emperor of Russia. The Galicia of the ancient partition has remained almost entirely in the power of Austria. His Majesty has never had in view the re-establishment of Poland. In the opinion of the Emperor, this final move ought to remove the last hesitations of Alexander, and assure a favorable response to his marriage proposition. Chapters 13 and 14